Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on an unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at kyndryl.com. We all know the music, but few of us have looked at the machinery of the Swift phenomenon quite like today's guest. He's an editor at Harvard Business Review Press by day, but he has spent over 2 years acting as a Parisian tour guide for Taylor Swift's career, taking us past the familiar sights of stadium tours and hit singles to show us the gritty, brilliant strategy underneath. He admits that while Taylor might not be reading B-school textbooks, she is instinctively perfecting the moves they teach. He uses his unique lens on strategy, organizational insights, innovation, and leadership to take us on a tour through the art, psychology, and business of a cultural icon. I was thinking about this. He's also an editor, and he was producing so many other people's albums, and he decided, actually, I'm going to write my own. We welcome the author of There's Nothing Like This, the strategic genius of Taylor Swift, Kevin Evers. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you on the show, man. You've made me into a Taylor Swift fan. I have to tell you, man.
I've heard this a lot. I've converted a lot of people into Taylor Swift fans. Not like she needs me to do that. I mean, she's so popular already, but I'm glad to do it.
Well, for my era, maybe she does. But it's funny, man. You know, as we're reading it and reading the history and the struggles we all go through, the self-doubt and all that. But it's told from your perspective, your unique perspective, as I said in the intro, all the people you've worked with, many people who've been on this show. And I think it's that objective lens. And then obviously your daughter is a great fan as well. And you've joined her at concerts and had unique dad-daughter moments as well. And that's kind of brought you into the Taylor Swift universe. But I'd love to just share that unique lens I mentioned in the intro, all these people you've worked with. And maybe you might mention some of them, because that comes true in the book. And that's what makes it a very interesting, part biography, but also a unique lens through your lens of how business works and psychology and indeed strategy.
I always tell my authors, every author I work with, I always say, how is this a book that only you could write? And I ask myself that question too. There's a lot of books now about Taylor Swift, and they tackle Taylor Swift from different angles. But since I'm an editor at Harvard Business Review, I've been privy to a lot of great thinkers and a lot of great content about creativity, innovation, marketing, you name it, digital disruption. And I really thought that I could take all of that knowledge and apply it to Taylor Swift's career. I really did see a great opportunity here to write a book that was both fascinating and insightful. I thought that I could really follow Taylor from her early days all the way up to current day, and to follow her career in chronological order, to see how the music industry had swirled and changed around her, and see how she adapted to those changes and adapted based on sort of the wants and needs of her fan base and the overall industry. And I really thought that I could bring in a lot of great research, great thinking from other people to really sort of explain how she's become such a phenomenon over the course of 20 years.
I thought we'd start a little bit differently because due to the book, I only heard of Taylor Swift with that song, We're Never Ever Getting Back Together. And,
Yep.
and I knew about the Kanye stuff, I knew about all that. But in your mind, when you're not actually a fan of that, it's not that I wasn't a fan, I just don't play in that area. But it made me realize the longevity and the amount of hits and the reinventions she's had, and she calls them reinventions as well. But I thought to show that to our audience, I found some footage of an 11-year-old Taylor Swift when she sang the national anthem at the 2002 76ers game. I thought I'd play that. And the reason I'd play it is to tee you up for how long she's been doing this and how driven she was. And it's that drive from a very, very young age that is just remarkable, that is not always supported. And she was hugely supported, even moving to Nashville, as you said. But I'm going to play that, and then maybe you'll tell us about that drive and the early time that started in this young girl.
Yeah, I love that clip. That's actually how the book begins, looking at in my case, it was a photo of Taylor. And if you watch that video, she looks like your average American girl, right? She's the blonde hair, the blue eyes. I doubt that a lot of people who are in that stadium, that in that arena, thought, "Oh, this is going to be the next Michael Jackson. This is going to be the next Beatles." Um, but at the same time, what really struck me, because I didn't know much about her early career, when her first album came out when she was 16. I was in my early 20s listening to Radiohead. Taylor Swift really wasn't on my radar, and I didn't listen to country music. But if you look at her early career, I mean, you can see all the traits of a high performer. She was extremely driven. She convinced her parents to move the family to Nashville. And of course, they had the means to be able to do that. But she was also highly skilled too. She was a really great songwriter from an early age. And I put a lot of quotes in the book from executives who were around her, for fellow songwriters who were around her at the time. And they were all pretty amazed by her ability, but most of all, her vision. She had such a clear vision for what she wanted to do. She knew the artist that she wanted to be. And, many of us struggle with that. I'm in my early 40s and I struggle with the person I want to be, but she was just very laser focused. And she wanted to write her own songs. She wanted to write those songs for an audience of her peers. And she didn't take no for an answer. And that type of ambition really drove a lot of pretty unconventional decisions that she made. And one of the biggest ones is she had a development deal with RCA Records. RCA Records was one of the biggest music labels on Nashville's Music Row, and they don't give out development deals very lightly. And Taylor was the youngest one to have a development deal. She was 14 at the time, but she didn't feel like they really believed in her vision. So she walked away from that development deal after a year, which is a pretty extraordinary thing for a 14-year-old to do. Since those development deals are so hard to get, you would think that people would stick it out a little bit more, but that's not what she did. And during that period of her career, she also made a lot of other pretty brave, bold, and unconventional decisions, but it was all based on that very, very, very clear vision that she had.
Some of the interesting things that you find in the book was you realize how male oriented it was. Now, we'll remind our audience, it was country and Western music
Yep.
essentially
Yeah, this
first.
was this was country music. So this was in the early 2000s, and there were some pretty major shifts in country music that presented a lot of challenges for Taylor. Now, in the very early 2000s, the late 1990s, there was a surge of female artists in country music. You could think of the Chicks, Shania Twain, Faith Hill were huge acts in country music. But by the early 2000s into about 2004, 2005, there's a lot of consolidation that happened in the music industry, especially in country music. A lot of big conglomerates came in and bought local country music radio stations. And because of that, the playlist on those stations became pretty homogenized. They were very data driven. And because of that, most of the artists who were played on radio were men, right? And they all kind of looked and sounded the same. They all had their Stetson hats or trucker caps. And it was really hard for female artists at that point to break out. So even though Taylor had this clear vision of what she wanted to do, there were a lot of institutional and industry-wide challenges that she had to face and get past.
One of the things that's interesting, and I thought it was good to share, was again how how male dominated the industry was. But what many of us won't know is that the songs were written by usually older men in their 50s. And one of the things Taylor pushed back on, it was a really interesting little conversation where like these absolute legendary songwriters from Nashville, Robert Ellis Orrell and Angelo Petraglia. And so they start writing songs and playing them for her, and she's like, that's kind of trite. And like, she's a teenage girl here, and they're like, huh? And then she's like, I'm not sure my demographic would say anything like this. And the reason I say that was what you realize by reading the evolution of Taylor Swift is that she was talking to herself in many ways, and she evolved the music to how she evolved. So she wasn't singing at a level above her. She wasn't then later singing at a level below her. she was actually really sharing her diary. And I thought it was interesting that you say she kept the diary and she shares a lot of the entries to that diary over her life.
Yeah, it's such a great point because I think when a lot of people hear, "Oh, she wanted to write her own songs," that may not sound extraordinary, but popular music, whether it's pop music or country music, is is really songwriter driven, and they're usually teams of songwriters that write those songs. And so there were other teen artists that tried to make it in country music. Leanne Rimes was a big one, and she did find success, but she had trouble finding longevity. And I think a big reason for that, and I think a big reason why other teenage artists failed, is that they were writing songs that were written by people who were older than them. And if you listen to a lot of those songs, they have mature voices and their voices sound great, but what they're singing about seems a little more mature than their age. And Taylor didn't want to do that. She really wanted to write songs from her own perspective, which was unique at the time. And she wanted to write really personal songs about her passions, her dreams, her obsessions, her experiences. And you're right. I mean, I did start the book out with that story where she's in a songwriting room. I think she's 13 or 14 years old, in a room with men who are 3 to 4 times her age who've been doing this for a long time, and they're laying down a track, and she's writing the lyrics, and they're developing the melody, and they throw out some lyrics, and she says, "You know what? That's not just not quite right for my audience." She always had this idea of, "I wanna write these personal songs, but they have to be right for my audience." And this is a lesson for anyone who it's a simple lesson, but it's one that we tend to forget or we stray from is, if you have any product, you want to make sure that you're meeting the demands and wants of your audience. And sometimes that can be hard to comprehend of what exactly that is, but Taylor was always really laser focused on what that was. And that's what made her different in country music. In many ways, she followed the norms of country music. She wasn't someone who came in and tried to break all the rules. She looked like she was a country music singer. She looked like she was the youngest daughter of a female country singer. She played in the traditional forms of country music. Her songs sounded like country music early on. But I think the novelty here is that she decided to write from her own unique perspective, and that within those frameworks, she was singing very personal songs that 16-year-old girls could relate to.
And she came from a very musical background. Her name as well, I didn't realize this till I read the book. James Taylor, she named after the famous artist as well, and musical grandmother, etc., etc. But read the book to dig into those details. One of the things I just wanted to lean into was you mentioned the RCA development contract. It reminded me of my own background as a professional rugby player. And I saw this so many times, Kevin, where you'll have a school, well, it was men, so schoolboy star that comes straight out of school. They're maybe the top player in the world or ranked that top in the world. They get into then the academy of the professional teams here in Ireland, and Ireland's one of the best, has one of the best club systems in the world. But then, to your point in the book, they're shelved. And it's like, oh, they're not quite mature yet. And in that, you see, and I'm seeing this so many times, brilliant, brilliant players come in, they stagnate, or sometimes they haven't actually built the discipline of hard work because they were just talented and they weren't
Yep.
disciplined. And I found the Taylor story incredible vision, but unbelievable hustle and hard work. But then on top of that, just a reluctance or a determination not to be put on the shelf.
Yeah.
And that led to this huge jump for her to go then with Borchetta. And I'd love you to tell us that little step in the story.
Yeah, I think if you had a blind test and showed someone, "Hey, would you rather go with a major label that has a ton of resources, or would you rather go with a man who just started a music label and didn't have a resource headquarters or a staff at that point?" I think most people would pick the major label. But in this case, Taylor picked the man who just started his music label, and his name, as you mentioned, was Scott Borchetta. Now, Scott Borchetta, he wasn't selling contracts out of the back of a Buick. Like, he was well known in the industry. He was a big promotional guy, had worked for Universal Label Group, and he found Taylor and loved her music and thought that she could be a star. And he said, "Listen, I want to sign you, but there's one catch. I'm leaving Universal Music Group to start my own label." But he really believed in her vision. He told her, "I'm never going to tell you to write someone else's songs. to perform someone else's songs. I want you to write and perform your own songs. And that was huge for Taylor. But I also think he had the hustle. He had that entrepreneurial mindset to really push her because he needed her to succeed. He was the third artist that he had signed to his new label. And back in 2004, 2006, it was a really tough time in the music industry, especially in country music. But he was really willing to hustle. He had a lot of skin in the game. And I think Taylor made the right decision. I mean, in hindsight, obviously she made the right decision, but she ended up going with someone who could really hustle, not worry about bureaucracy, not worry about appeasing their bosses. He had he needed her to succeed, and he was going to do everything that he could to make her succeed. And that ended up being one of the most fruitful relationships in music industry history.
It's funny, in my notes I have it written down, her Jerry Maguire moment. You know, who's with me? You know, that whole thing. And it was very much one of those where she's like, he was going to sign her for RCA, and then it's like, going, look, here's the deal. I'm out of here. I'll set you up, or else you can come with me and do things differently. And it was again that bravery that showed up time and time again. And to just, I'm putting it now as a dad. I mean, you're a dad to a teenage girl. You know, if she had this moment being offered to her, you'd probably go, you know, you should take it. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. And the fact that her parents went, no, you make the decisions, or maybe it was hers that I'm making the decisions around here. Those things come up time and time again. But I loved how you drew analogies between Swift and Borchetta and Marvel Comics. I'd love you to riff on that for a little bit.
Yeah. So a big reason why Taylor succeeded, and this is going to sound simple, it's more complex than the way I'll describe it, but she seized an opportunity that other people were ignoring. Her and Scott Borchetta, they thought that there was a market for her music. They thought that there was an audience of teenage girls that would flock to her music. The consensus in country music is, hey, we've done that before and it didn't work out. So this isn't a thing that we want to do. You need to wait until you're 18, 21 years old in order to release an album. They didn't think that was the right thing to do. They wanted to put out an album as soon as possible. And this is something very similar to what Marvel did in the 1960s. Marvel in the 1960s was not the Marvel that we know today. It was a pretty small publisher. It was dwarfed by DC Comics. And Marvel, under the tutelage of Stan Lee and others, decided, well, you know what? Most comic books are aimed toward children. And we think that there's an audience, an overlooked audience, which in business parlance we would call non-consumers, who love comic books. And they thought that that people in college, young adults in college, would still love comic books. So they changed their editorial strategy. They started to make stories and comics that were more directed toward that audience, that were a little more mature. And those characters were really dealing with lots of human problems that fan base could relate to. And it ended up working really well. And in business parlance, you'd call this a blue ocean strategy, where they seized that opportunity that all these other publishers were ignoring. And then they specifically catered their product to these perceived non-consumers. And because of that, they experienced rapid growth in the 60s. And Taylor and Scott Borchetta did the same thing. They went after non-consumers, which was the teenage girl market in country music. And then they made sure to specifically cater her music to that audience. And then once she broke through, which was really hard to do, and there was no certainty that she would do it, she was a category of one. She really didn't have much competition in country music because there's no one else like Taylor Swift.
I love that you brought in the blue ocean. I love that you brought in non-consumers. You're talking to exactly the right audience for this stuff, Kevin. But I thought I'd share a little something. When I'm promoting a book or I'm inspired by a book, often we'll create like a cartoon or an illustration. And when I read this part of the book, I was like, I have to share this for Kevin. So I'll send this to you afterwards. But this was the idea of Borchetta and Swift, where it was what you call in the book, and you cite the research of a psychologist called Michelle Gelfand, and what she called it was this was a tight culture. So it was a culture that firmly held on to traditions and values, examples of tight cultures you mentioned in the book: military, religious communities, corporations, etc. Sometimes fandoms as well, that you say. But she had to fit in a brand new style of music through what Borchetta said was a Trojan horse strategy in a way. So she had to keep onto the traditions of country music and get onto those radios in cars, trucks, boats, and bedrooms, but try to bring a new country style there. And she did that in a beautiful way by releasing a song after a country music western, Tim McGraw. I'd love you to tell us about this little period of the story.
The only way Taylor could achieve success in country music at the time, I remember this was 2006, is she needed radio to succeed. There's the only way to success in country music was through radio. And of course, we've talked about all the challenges there because it was very male dominated at the time. So since country music was such a tight culture, which means it really holds on to its norms and traditions, and Taylor really couldn't rock the boat too much, right? She couldn't start out her career with a single that was really pop driven because I think that would alienate radio programmers. So she had to find a way to release a song that would be familiar to country music fans and programmers at radio stations. And Tim McGraw was the perfect song because it sounds like a very traditional country music song. It uses it's like a very familiar chord structure that dates back to the 1960s that listeners and radio programmers would really find familiar and would like. And but at the same time, she had to find a way to be novel too. She had to show what her strengths were. So within that traditional structure, it does sound like a different song. And the difference is that here you have someone who sounds like a 16-year-old girl. She doesn't sound more mature than her age, singing about a boyfriend going off to college, which is a very specific thing to her and girls her age. So she found a way, and you mentioned the term Trojan horse, is that it was so familiar. It was using traditional structures, so it really pulled people in. It didn't alienate people, yet it was different enough that it appealed to people too, right? And I think that balance between familiarity and novelty is really critical in music in general, but I think in this case, it was really critical to her success because there were other songs on that album that were more Taylor, so to speak, were a little more pop driven, pop punk driven, but those would have been too different to start off with at first. She really had to start with something that was familiar, but different enough that it would appeal to the audience that she wanted to appeal to.
One of the things you learn from reading about innovation, Kevin, is that sometimes it's the way you frame it. And that story about Tim McGraw reminded me of, like, for example, The Lion King. They couldn't get that made. And it was until they started saying, well, it's just Hamlet with lions. And people are going, ah. And that type of familiarity to get it onto the radio was just, for me, that was like the genius of Borchetta and Swift coming together and her willingness to do that and not go, no, I'm doing it my way. So this leads to her debut album, and it goes on to be unbelievable. Slow start, but then ends up having 7 million physical and digital units sold eventually. Let's share a little bit about that, and then that'll lead us into the beautiful term. And I've written a piece about this, second album syndrome, because second album syndrome is exactly what happens in business all the time.
The fact that Taylor's debut album got off to a modest start, I think worked to her advantage. And we've seen this with other artists who just come out of nowhere and have a huge hit. And I think it tends to alienate people because I think listeners feel as if that person hasn't earned it. And Taylor really needed to hustle. Once the album came out on the heels of the Tim McGraw single, I mean, it did okay. I think it was in the top 50 in country music, but she really hustled. And she used MySpace, yes, but it was really a lot of on the ground hustling. She played small venues. She played baseball stadiums. She played in parking lots of colleges. She played so many shows to sort of build up that fan base. She opened for a lot of artists too. And so she slowly but surely built up that teenage girl audience. And she would stay after shows and she would sign autographs for hours, right? She really valued that one-on-one connection. And this is the one thing I think that really sets Taylor apart is that she understands what it takes to be a star. Yes, there's a lot of luck and randomness involved, and talent is involved. Yes, but superstars aren't self-made. They're created by fans. And she has always been extremely fan obsessed. You can see it very early on in her career. And I think this is one of the big reasons, beyond her talent and her songwriting talent, why she found early success and why she's continued to find success is because she continues to be as fan obsessed as possible. And even as she's grown into the most popular, successful, and famous music artist that we have, at least in North America, she still remains fan obsessed, and she knows how to get her fans to spread her ideas, to spread the love. And that's, I would argue, is probably the top reason why she's in the position that she is today.
Maybe we'll share the concept of second album syndrome, because I think it's a key concept that's very relevant to business when some change in the market happens, like your customers, your consumer preferences change, and now you have to do something different. And you mentioned here Zook and Allen and the idea of the avoidance of premature core abandonment.
So after the huge success, slow but eventual huge success of her first album, Taylor, like many artists, was faced with, well, what do I do? How do I pivot here? How often do I change? Or how much do I change? Do I make a big pivot or do I keep doing what I'm doing? And both of those have pros and cons. If you keep doing what you're doing, well, it can't be so similar to your first effort, because if it's too similar, then fans will be disappointed and they'll feel like you haven't grown as an artist. But if you change too much, they may feel alienated because they may feel like your music is much different than what it was. And the things that they fell in love with, you may be avoiding. And I think in this situation, a lot of artists do prematurely abandon what they're really good at. Maybe they get early success and they rebel against it. Maybe that's not what they want to do. Maybe their first album was, maybe the music label had too much of a impact on their music and they didn't quite feel like it was theirs. So then they try to rebel against that and make a much different album the second time around. I think what Taylor did with her second album is she stayed in her lane. Yes, she moved to a more pop driven sound with Fearless, which was her second album, but it was still Taylor. I would say it was a more amped up version of her first album. She was doing a lot of the same things, but she was doing it much better. And I think that was also another reason why that album really found success and why she was able to bring along her fan base from her first album to her second album and grow that fan base, is because she was really in the pocket of, I'm going to make changes, but I'm not going to make so many changes that it alienates my fan base.
Including the songwriting as well, as you tell us in the book. And again, there's a lot of details in here. There's huge amount of detail in here. And just wanted to say as well, Kevin, one of the big challenges for me reading the book was when I get inspired by a book like this, I start going down rabbit holes. I was looking at YouTube videos over here. I was even listening to the songs. And for example, the Blue Ocean Strategy, there's actually a case study on Taylor Swift as well, and about how she went for Blue Ocean. So there's so much detail behind the book, and you brilliantly bring it to life, and it's a really enjoyable read as well. But one of the things you start doing is, so I looked at those early footage of her playing everywhere because she was around and she was lucky enough to be there at the dawn of the internet, at the MySpace period, etc. But she really hustled. But this brings us up to then the challenges she faced, because it wasn't all princesses and fairy tales. She worked hard. She had a lot of pushback. And one of the ones we saw, the most public one, was when Kanye West did that awful thing, and she garnered a lot of sympathy. And while it was really negative, it also was the first time many people had heard of Taylor Swift.
Taylor is, and this is true today, and it was true back in 2008, which is the time period we're talking about. She's an odd superstar because she gets a lot of praise. She gets her flowers, don't get me wrong, and always has. But there always seems to be an equal amount of pushback and negative criticism too, for whatever reason. And there's a lot of reasons we could go into, but she's a hot button topic for people. and she conjures a lot of feelings in people, a lot of love and a lot of hatred at the same time. And a big reason for this, especially early on in her career, is that she was a teenage girl singing for other teenage girls. And I think historically, artists like that have received a lot of skepticism. You can even look back to the Beatles. The Beatles received a lot of skepticism as too very early on in their career, because we've all seen the images of the, teenage girls screaming at the sight of them when they start playing. And I think at the time, especially with the Beatles, there's this feeling that there was a contagion. We think of the term Beatlemania, which is a positive term, but it's also not a term of endearment too. The word mania is in Beatlemania. It's as if teenage girls are just obsessed with the person, but not necessarily the music, and that they're just overcome with emotion and they're not necessarily thinking logically, right? But of course, when we all listen to music and we all love the artists that we love, it's a combination of logic and emotion. Um, so Taylor at the time, this is back in 2008, was really receiving a lot of criticism. And she received an award at the MTV Music Awards, and Kanye West all of a sudden appeared on stage, took her mic and said, basically, you don't belong here. This award belongs to Beyonce. And I think most of us would probably feel humiliated if that happened to us. Kanye at the time, this is before he sort of went off the deep end, he was known as the most innovative rapper and producer that there was. And so here's someone who is a legend in the music industry getting up on stage and saying, you don't quite belong here. And there was also a lot of other criticism around Taylor at the time, that she couldn't sing. She received a Grammy Award months later for Album of the Year, which is the most prestigious award at the Grammys. And she was only 18 at the time. She was really, really young to receive an award of that stature. Yet she had a performance with Stevie Nicks during that ceremony that was not very good. She was pitchy and it wasn't a great performance. But since she received this award, a lot of people just jumped to criticize her, and were pretty savage on Twitter and other social media platforms. And other critics too wrote think pieces about, why is it that Taylor Swift can't sing? Why is she so popular when she's such a bad singer? And yeah, I mean, this is something that's always followed her, and it still follows her to this day, is this feeling of, why is it that Taylor Swift is so popular when she doesn't necessarily have the physical talent that we would think would lend itself to superstardom? She doesn't have the great voice of Florence Welch or Adele. She doesn't dance like Beyonce. She seems relatively average in her skill set, um, beyond her songwriting. I think this confuses a lot of people. But of course, us in the business world know that, yes, her product is important, her talent is important, but I think it's her business decisions and her ability to sort of build a fan base around her that it really is what sets her apart. And Clay Christensen has a great quote where he talks about his job to be done theory, where he says, companies that have like a really great idea of what customers are hiring them to do. So in other words, companies that really understand the inner lives of their consumers are able to build products that some people can't quite understand, that can't be copied, and can't be comprehended in many ways. And I put Taylor Swift directly into that category. She knows exactly what she's doing. She knows what she's really good at. She knows what her fans want from her, and she's able to build that community around her. I think that's why a lot of critics are confused by her success. But if you look at it through a business lens, it makes total sense why she's so successful.
I love that you brought in jobs to be done as well. Another huge part of the show that comes up on a regular basis. I thought about that, and that jobs to be done. You mentioned here, by the way, and I'll leave people to read the book American Girl, and Pleasant Rowland, who created that as a jobs to be done for young girls, creating these dolls. But I loved then the quote by Rick Rubin. He said here, this is a quote from Rubin: the reason that you are who you are and the reason that you're finding the success you're finding is because you've been true to yourself to get to that stage. To start changing that, to conform to someone else's idea of what you should be doing, is the problem. That
Yes.
just doesn't make sense, he says. And I love that quote. And then you go on to quote an indie artist, Phoebe Bridgers, who said, Taylor has always told the truth. She's written songs from exactly where she is. I'm grateful to have grown up in a world with Taylor Swift in it.
That's such a great point because a lot of the criticism that she faced, it wasn't just about her voice, it was about her aesthetic. People thought that it was too twee or too teenage. And it was also what she was singing about. I think people were like, what are you doing? These songs sound too juvenile. And Taylor could have pivoted. She could have tried to sound more mature than she was, but I think she understood that, well, this is actually what I'm good at. This is from my own perspective. And this is what my fans are relating to. Obviously, it's working. So I wouldn't say she completely shut out the outside noise. Obviously, the event with Kanye and the criticism did have an effect on her, and she's later talked about that. But I think the lesson here is she really stood her ground. She didn't take that criticism and try to change herself. In fact, when she was coming off of that second album and all that criticism and praise that she received, her third album, she really stuck to her guns. I mean, she decided to write that album all by herself. And I think a lot of it, she was touring, so she couldn't really work with other co-writers at the time. But I think it was also a message of defiance to her critics. She said, well, if you don't think I'm a great artist, well, I'm just going to do this all by myself. I'm not going to use any co-writers. And then, of course, she used that as part of her marketing campaign. But I think that pivot going from her second to third album is really important because there was so much criticism and negativity around her. Yet, I think since she was so laser focused, she knew what her fans were hiring her to do. She delivered that and really doubled and tripled down on her strengths rather than retreating from them.
I love that you used the term hiring or to do as well. Job is to be done language there, Kevin. You've obviously done your research, but I wanted to just point a few things. One thing to say that was a beautiful bit of justice was, so Kanye's problem was that Beyonce had done this video, All the Single Ladies, and it was the best video of all time. She goes on to win video of the year later on. So Kanye kind of piped up too early, but then beautifully she brings Taylor back on stage and says, you know, I was once this 17-year-old girl. I know what it's like. And that made me think that, hey, the problem here is a lot of the critics are actually just a different generation.
Yep.
And as you said, it was pre-digital landscape evolving. So they couldn't even understand what she was doing. And it's like us maybe criticizing how kids use emojis or how they use TikTok today. When we grew up, we didn't even grow up in a Facebook era. So it's that making a decision from a different perspective. And, you know, it's a killer of dreams and a killer of so many people's potential when somebody says you shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
And I love that she made it and she defied those type of people. But let's fast forward a bit here, because I mentioned something that's really important and how innovative she was. Clay, as you mentioned, Clay Christensen, creator of Job Speed on Theory, argued, when you see a product or service that no one else has successfully copied, the product itself is rarely the source of long-term competitive advantage. And for Swift, it wasn't just the music. It wasn't just the songwriting. It was the package, including, as you say, she didn't just adapt to an evolving digital landscape. She actually helped shape it. She was showing others how to actually use this, including the hustle of, as you said, answering comments, engaging with her fans, leaving little Easter eggs throughout the digital landscape that would only make sense. They were like jigsaw pieces or breadcrumbs that only made sense then when you went to a concert. And she was giving people hints to who are these songs she's writing about, et cetera, et cetera. And it's that holistic piece that's so hard to imitate.
Oh, for sure. And you can see it in everything that she does. So this goes back to like what her fans are hiring her to do. And in like a very simple sense, I would say her fans are really looking for a deep personal connection with her. They're looking for vulnerability and intimacy. And they're looking for songs and experiences that help them connect to Taylor, but also connect with other fans. So you can look at everything that Taylor does. And sometimes she strays from this, but for the most part, when she's successful, she really stays true to this job to be done. And you can hear it in the way that she sings her songs. It's very intimate, especially if you look at not so much like the huge pop songs, but even in those, she sings in a similar way. It's very intimate. She's singing very close to the mic. And this probably goes to like the types of microphones that she uses. Also, her music, the production never overwhelms the voice. The voice is always up front in the mix. It's always the central part of the song. There's other pop songs, other artists, even other country songs where the production seems to be the the point of emphasis in a song, but it's hardly ever like that in a Taylor Swift song, right? So it feels like she's whispering in your ear, and you can see the way how she interacts with fans. I think she understands that fans want something more from her than just music. And this was a big shift in sort of the early 2000s, the mid 2000s into about 2010, where the internet did change fandom. Fandom used to happen and it used to be isolated, right? You'd have to opt into fandom, you'd have to find other fans. But of course, social media changed a lot of that. MySpace, and then Tumblr, of course, was huge. And then now Instagram and TikTok. And Taylor has always tried to build experiences around her music. You mentioned how she would drop clues in her liner notes. So if you're a fan, you would look at some of the capitalized words and you would try to figure out what she was trying to talk about. In some cases, it was the name of the person who the song was about, right? Which would lead fans, one, to feel like she was speaking a secret language to them, but then also as a way to relate to other fans. And then, of course, her concerts are these huge extravaganzas where the Eras Tour is a little bit different, but normally she'd release an album, and instead of playing, her greatest hits and then sprinkling in some new songs, the whole entire concert was built around the concept of each album. And, it's just a way to really build community. And what's really interesting these days is if you're not a Taylor Swift fan and you go on TikTok or you go on Instagram and you see all these videos of Taylor Swift, you'd probably be very, very confused because a lot of her marketing now isn't really directed toward a mass audience. It's really, really super consumer focused. It's really focused on her fans. And a lot of these hints and clues that she drops are things that only her fans would quite understand. Yet that news spreads, their enthusiasm spreads across the internet, across TikTok, across Instagram, and it brings in sort of casual and non-fans as well. But I think this is I would say this is a differentiator for Taylor. Even though she's this huge artist, I think she's always taken a very fan first attitude. And she's more focused on building this community with her fans, building this secret language with her fans, building this strong bond with her fans. And then the rest comes after. And that's her first priority, is always her fans.
You mentioned a beautiful father-daughter moment with your daughter Maisie at one of the concerts as well, and particularly a song called Dear John, which you described as a gamified experience for the audience. And, I was looking for it and I found it. I found footage of that live performance, and I stumbled upon another video then, and it was a comedian, and Taylor Swift was in the audience. He's like going, "Hey guys, don't ever go out with Taylor Swift because she'll write a song about you." And that shows up time and time again. But in this song, Dear John, it was one of the first kind of times it was quite obvious that she was talking about one of her previous boyfriends.
For sure. And this is another point of criticism that she gets a lot, is that, she just writes about her exes, or she puts her exes on blast. I think that's an exaggeration. I think it's an unfortunate criticism because that's what songwriters do. But I also think it's a good strategy. Now, in the past, she's had different opinions about this. She has said, yeah, of course, like, I'm talking about my exes, and, that's the way that the internet works, and that's my strategy. And then she's sort of walked back that in recent years and said, you know what, these songs are for everybody. And I think she says that because she's received a lot of criticism. In my mind, I think it's a great strategy. I think it's a great songwriting strategy, and I think it's a great business strategy. It's a great songwriting strategy because her songs, for the most part, seem really personal. I think a lot of artists try to make their music as general as possible because they think it'll reach the widest audience, and Taylor doesn't do that. They sound like they're ripped from her diaries. She uses very specific details, and I think that brings her fans closer to her. I think it makes their songs more intimate, and then they can sort of relate those experiences to their own lives. But I think the connection with her fans is really important, and the fact that her songs are so hyper specific, I think it's a positive. But I also think it plays into how the internet works and how fandom works. Fans are always going to speculate, right? And she has a choice. She could generalize her songs so they won't speculate, or she could give hyper specific examples. And I think the fact that her songs are so hyper specific it does lead to a lot of chatter online. And her fans dissect her songs like scholars dissect T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I mean, the fandom is really smart, it's really literary, and they like to dissect songs. And you mentioned Dear John. I mean, she does a lot of really clever things in that song. There's callbacks to John Mayer's music. The guitar in that song very subtly sounds like John Mayer's tone. It sounds like a John Mayer performance. But I think what's really interesting about that song is that you think that the guitar is going to build up to this crescendo and this great solo, but it never quite happens, right? So it's a really clever way of showing how that relationship fizzled out. And really smart fans are going to dissect that music inch by inch, every sound, every lyric, and they do. And that continues to this day. And I also think that's a reason why her fans are so devoted, because they're able to really deep dive into her music, which is stuff that scholars do to poets, other scholars do with literary text, and Taylor Swift's music is no different.
I was telling you before we came on air, I'm just after finishing correcting 100 student essays. And I always tell the students every year is like, write from yourself, from your own perspective about, so I usually ask them to write about the impact of AI on society through the lens of the module that I give. And they connect the dots through the module, but I ask them to include some personal anecdote or something. And otherwise it just feels so bland. And
Yep.
You told me before you came on air, as an acquiring editor, you're looking for a book that only you can write. And that's what I felt reading this book, your book, was only you could write this book, but only Taylor could write her own music.
Yeah.
Now, later on, she leaned into different producers and she had co-authored some of the earlier songs, but she was at the heart of it, as you said, reflecting an inner mirror, like what's going on inside her life. So of course she's going to tell stories about the relationships because she was authentic to those relationships.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And, we think that a lot of artists are at the center of everything that they do, that they're in full control of what they do, but they're a product. They're working for major labels and there's A&R reps who are trying to push them in different directions, and in some cases in really positive directions. But I think what sets Taylor apart, and there's some other artists that do this too, she's not the only one, is that she's really the CEO of what she's doing. And this goes back to her vision. She has a really clear vision of who she is and what she should be doing. And because of that, she's able to surround herself with people who are really, really good at what they do. But it's her vision, her really clear vision that's driving everything that she does. And there's a new docu-series that's out about the making of the Eras Tour. That's on Disney Plus, and you can see it's a behind the scenes documentary, and you can see how clear her vision is there and how she's able to get her dancers, her choreographers, everyone that works for her to do everything in her image, right? And it's all crystal clear. And when you go to the concert, you can feel that vision. And it's a really, really critical skill to have. And she definitely has it in spades.
As you say, it's a North Star. And when you have one of those, when you have your vision, when you have your North Star, it helps make decisions. So you compare them to that future version of yourself.
And I think in terms of like a leadership, when you watch this docuseries, you'll see, yes, she has a very clear vision of what she wants to do, but she's also a very humble leader. She surrounds herself with people who are really great at what she does. So she has the vision, but then she lets them do what they need to do, right? I mean, she's going to fine tune and tweak, but she doesn't seem to be like a crazy micromanager. And I think a big reason for that is like, if you have such a clear vision, then people will be able to give you what you want, but also throw in their own creativity and their own input to what you do. And that's another great trait that she has. And it was great to see it in action because I hadn't seen it before. There's never video of her sort of leading other people, but it's pretty extraordinary. She does seem to have the traits of a great leader. Yes, she has great vision, but she's also humble enough to realize that she's not going about this alone, and that it's really important to rely on the expertise of others too.
There's a guest we've had on the show a few times, Bob Johansson, and he was the former director of Institute for the Future. He has a great line. He says, you have to be extremely clear on your vision as an organization, as a leader. but very flexible about how you achieve that.
Yep.
And what you said right back to when she was a kid, she used to, this is her speaking, you quote her, she's like, I used to lie awake at night dreaming about that future, but then I think very carefully about how to achieve it. And I thought that's the difference. I tell my kids, like I have 2 young boys and they both have dreams. And it's like, go have the vision, think about it regularly, dream it, imagine it's already happened, but then do the work,
Yeah,
because that's what people don't do. And
for
she
sure.
totally did the work.
For sure. Oh, yeah. And she continues to do that work. I look at the Eras tour where the demand for that concert was so high. Ticketmaster said that she would have had to play 900 shows in the US alone to meet the demand for that tour. And she hadn't toured in years. So the enthusiasm was so high. She could have played a 2-hour greatest hit style show, and I think her fans would have walked away and they would have been joyous. But instead, she plays 3.5-hour shows, a set list that spans 40 plus songs. And she's doing it in some cases 3 nights in a row. That had to come at a great emotional and physical toll for her, but also her dancers, her band, her crew. Yet she did it anyway. And that's just the type of artist that she is, where she's really trying to go above and beyond for her fans. And just more so than what her fans would expect her to do or could reasonably want her to do. Yet she continually exceeds those expectations, sets high expectations, but then exceeds those high expectations, which is another reason why she's in the position that she is.
I always credit people like that. Like they worked for that success. They've made massive sacrifices for that success. They
Yep.
can't walk down the street because of that success.
Yep.
And yeah, yes, they wanted that life, but there's a price you pay for that kind of success, and she totally deserves it. So at this stage, she's only 22, and she's leaned into what you called positive paranoia in the book. We are very familiar with Andy Grove and Only the Paranoid Survive. She's launching into a 4th album, and we talked about this regularly on the show, the concept of exploit and explore. James March was the original scholar who talked about that. Then Tushman and O'Reilly built on it. Wendy Smith, who you likely know from Harvard Business Review Press, she wrote about this with Marianne Lewis, the idea of both and strategies. And here, when you zoom out, as you do in the book, you go, up until now, 3 albums down, all massive success. She's used an incremental exploit strategy. She's exploited what she had, incrementally increasing as she's grown. But now came the time to explore. And you talk about the challenges she has on that. First, she's worked with this guy, Nathan Chapman, longtime producer, longtime collaborator. Now she has to break away from that. And you talk about this term, sudden breaks, and how this is an important thing that most companies or most people have to go through at a certain point in their development.
She needed a positive shock. At least she thought that she did. Because many artists that find success as teenagers have a hard time transitioning into their 20s. I think the consensus is normally their fan base matures much more quickly than the artist does, right? The music doesn't catch up to the maturity of the fans. They grow up, they mature, and then they just move on to other music. So Taylor was in this really interesting situation where she did need to evolve. And the only way to do that is she needed a positive shock. She needed to work with other collaborators, as tough as that was, because she really had such a close relationship with Nathan Chapman, who produced her first 3 albums. And she found that positive shock by working with a producer named Max Martin. Now, Max Martin, if listeners aren't familiar with him, is the most prolific producer and songwriter in history, I think only behind Paul McCartney and John Lennon. He has nearly as many #1 hits as a producer and songwriter as those two do. But there was a challenge here because Taylor had built herself as a DIY songwriter. All the marketing around her, all the videos on social that they showed of her, that her and her team showed, it's her writing her songs in the studio. A lot of the narrative around her is that she writes her own songs. But here she is working with a pop producer who really became famous by working with the likes of Britney Spears and the Backstreet Boys, who was really working in commercial pop. And there was a perception issue there, because you would think that those two working with Max Martin would run counter to everything that she had built her career on. Yet she still needed that positive shock. So she did decide to go with Max Martin, but it ended up being a great partnership because even though they're really different, their musical tastes are very similar. They're both essentialists. They both like to work in traditional forms. They both like to create songs that are so addictively familiar, yet different enough to like really catch your attention. And Max Martin was the master at this, even though he grew up as a pure pop producer, his music wasn't that much different than Taylor Swift's country music. So, I mean, this was a challenge because she's not only replacing the mandolins with pop beats, it was an issue of authenticity. And you would think that some of her fans may rebel against that. So she ended up writing 3 pure pop songs with Max Martin. Those ended up being her first number 1 hits on the Billboard charts. Yet at the same time, they sounded very of her age. They sounded very Taylor. They were co-written by her, so the lyrics are sharp. But she did receive some pushback from some fans. But I think she decided that she had to take that risk at that point, that she had to grow as an artist because not many artists make that transition into their 20s. And I think it also goes to show how competitive she is. I don't think she ever shies away from trying to get bigger and bigger and more popular. And I think a big way to do that was to move slowly into pop music. And that, of course, it ended up being a good move for her because she did get those number 1 hits and she did end up expanding her fan base. And one of her fears that she had talked about at the time was, I'm afraid that my songs are going to start sounding the same. Right. And she had already conquered country music and she wanted to change things up, and her own musical tastes were changing too. So that's what she ended up following. She ended up following her muse that was telling her to transition a little bit more into pop. And I guess the rest is history, right?
There's a great line I have to share from the book. You say, eventually the stability. So think here, she's 3 albums. She has a formula that works. And just replace an album with a business or a business model. Eventually the stability creates cognitive and social rigidity. You stop thinking in new ways. You stop hearing new ideas from outside your network, and it stifles creativity. But if you can venture outside your network, a shock, this positive shock, enables creators to accrue the advantages provided by open network structures and heterogeneous content. That's management speak, as you say, for staying relevant by changing. But I just wanted to quote this bit, and I'd love you to maybe expand on it. And here again, I'm asking people who are still with us, just replace music with a business or a business model, or if you're a wannabe author, a book. Since 2000, only 16 solo written songs have gone to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. In the 1970s, the average of songwriters per track was 1.7. These days, it's more than 4. So innovation is growing more difficult because of the growth of technology and the base of knowledge you need to innovate. It takes teams, not lone geniuses, to succeed. And that was one of the key things she did here, however difficult it was. And before I hand it over to you, you said here, and I love this quote, and this quote, as a person, anyone going through change, personal growth requires us to commit to learning. Learning requires us to acquire new skills, styles, behaviors, and acquiring new skills, styles, and behaviors requires us to endure a painstaking period of discomfort. The whole process can make us feel calculating and ungenuine. And that was the challenge. She had been so genuine that, and sticking to her guns of writing the songs, going through that period of, oh, I'm going to totally write it to prove you guys wrong, have criticized me. And now she has to go through this persona change. And it felt inauthentic. And I thought you encapsulated, that was the challenge so much for her.
For sure. And it was a big challenge because, as I mentioned, she had really built that fan base up on that intimacy and that connection, and pop music doesn't necessarily have that same connection. And I think, and I do talk about this in the book, some fans did rebel. They did hate her move into pop music. But I think Taylor had the long term in mind, right? Even though there's going to be some short term pain, and even though possibly some of her fans may not like what she's doing, it was really important for her to lean into the discomfort, work with someone who she might not have worked for or with in the past, and to really push her music forward. I think she realized that in the music industry, you really need to, especially once you've established your career, it's important to adapt and change. And that's what she's from this point forward, that's what she's done with every album, essentially, is to really try to change, but yet at the same time try to remain true to what her fans love about her.
And we're going to come back. Kevin has kindly agreed to come back, and we're going to talk about that reinvention, which is using parts of your old self in order to create yourself. The last thing I'd love you to share, though, because I hadn't heard this term before, and it was so relevant for her, because for the first time in her career, she was navigating what LVMH chairman Bernard Arnault calls the paradox of star brands. And that idea of evolving and staying relevant, but in a way that reminds you of why people love you in the first place.
Yeah, which is really, 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 really hard to do. Like, how do you stay edgy enough? How do you stay different enough to keep people around and keep people interested? Yet, how do you still remain true to the classic things that attract people in the first place? And these are things that Hermes deals with, Chanel, just these huge luxury brands that have a history behind them. And I would put Taylor in that category too, right? And the reason why she was so successful from an early age is that clear vision, that relatability, that songwriting that was really personal. Yet she still needs to change. She still needs to pivot. And that challenge of changing, yet remaining true to the very values and norms and aesthetic that fans love so much is a huge challenge. And it becomes a challenge for every new album that she releases at this point, right? It's always this question of, how do I make something that's different that my fans will love, yet doesn't stray so far from the things that make Taylor Swift, Taylor Swift.
For people in the meantime who want to find you, where's the best place to find out more about There's Nothing Like It This?
You can find me at nothinglikeThisBook.com or on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. Or you can follow me on Instagram at There's Nothing Like This.
Author of There's Nothing Like This, The Strategic Genius of Taylor Swift, Kevin Evers, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks once again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com.